The name Edgar Allan Poe conjures images of the macabre, murder, insanity, and self-destruction. But is this the real Edgar Allan Poe? Despite countless documentaries on the life of one of America's most celebrated writers, one inevitably encounters the same cartoonish narrative of a disturbed soul plagued by haunting visions, substance abuse, and fascinations with morbidity. The true sublime depth of Poe's mind and the strategic political nature of his most famous works is almost always buried under the slew of Halloween-grade caricatures and morbid characterizations. But that's all about to change. What follows is the true story of America's purloined soul, Edgar Allan Poe, and a true account of the double murder of one of America's foremost literary geniuses, first in body, then in memory. On October 3, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was found incoherent, wearing someone else's clothing, and most likely poisoned in Baltimore, Maryland. Within hours, he was admitted to a hospital, put under isolation in a hospice, and permitted no visitors for several days. By October 7th, the great poet was dead. On October 8, 1849, Poe's nemesis Rufus Griswold wrote a toxic national eulogy.
Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. There seemed to him no moral susceptibility, and what was more remarkable, in a proud nature, little or nothing of the true point of honor. He had to a morbid excess that desire to rise, which is vulgarly called ambition, but no wish for the esteem or the love of his species. Only the hard wish to succeed, not shine, not serve, but succeed, that he might have the right to despise a world which galled his self-conceit.
By a strange series of events, Griswold somehow managed to become Poe's official biographer, forging false letters attributed to Poe's hand. He even became the literary executor of Poe's estate, purchasing all of his personal letters from the author's impoverished aunt, and then painting the image of a drunken, death-obsessed, egotistical opium addict for all posterity. Less than 2 years later, Griswold also became the principal narrative controller of the biographies of Poe's lifelong friend, James Fenimore Cooper, author of the famous novels The Last of the Mohicans, The Spy, and The Bravo, whose untimely death in 1851 also smelled of poisoning. Griswold even chaired a committee memorializing the life of Cooper. But why would anyone go to such lengths to murder one of America's foremost men of letters twice, first in body and then in character? Poe was a literary figure, but was he something more? Audiences have been led to believe Poe's fictional pieces were simply the product of his own sick mind, something the notoriously deviant French writer and Poe translator Charles Baudelaire was convinced of. If the popular image is any indication, the world has yet to shed the vestiges of the false Poe mythology. In this light, revisiting Poe's works and the project of his final years should be seen as a question of historical justice, not merely a literary matter. As a leading literary figure in the young American Republic, Edgar Poe understood that in the war for human freedom, culture is everything. He was writing at a time when the nascent Republic's victory over the ancient forces of empire was still very fragile. It was clear to Poe that a society which tolerates a culture of immorality and mediocrity, where irrationalism and emotions defined the boundaries of truth, is a society destined to lose its powers of judgment, of differentiating between good and evil, healthy and sick minds, and sublime and perverse imaginations. Poe had always been fascinated by the nature of mind, identity, and the harmonies or disharmonies that generate healthy and unhealthy states of being. His short stories often explored the mind's capacity to fall into perversions of its higher divine nature. In the same way any doctor inquires into the multifaceted nature of illness before coming to a clear conception of health, so too must Poe's haunting tales of the macabre be inspected. Whether we are investigating the inner workings of the minds of protagonists of such tales as The Imp of the Perverse, The Telltale Heart, The Cask of Amontillado, The Black Cat, or William Wilson, Poe always offers us insight into the self-deluding mind of a sick soul, and most importantly, how ignorance of one's own undiagnosed self-delusions always quite lawfully lead to one's own downfall. In the story William Wilson, an elite young philandering playboy cannot comprehend why an evil doppelganger has followed him for years, undoing his efforts to cheat, lie, and steal at will. After being tortured by this gnawing figure who shares his appearance and even his name, William Wilson finds himself ragefully stabbing his enemy, only to discover that his enemy was always himself, or at least a conscience which he chose to ignore and treated as the villain. A similar motif can be found in The Imp of the Perverse, where a narrator muses about the perfect murder of an unnamed victim. Despite evading authorities for many months after committing what he believes is the perfect crime, the narrator recounts how something he suspects to be an imp possessed him like a demon, resulting in a public confession amidst hundreds of witnesses. As the reader discovers, the narrator awaiting his execution is made clear that the murderer never realized that this imp was always his oppressed conscience, which acted much like a force of natural law upon the perpetrator. The same theme is treated in The Telltale Heart, where another murderer carries out a gruesome killing of a rich old man whom he served. As police arrive at the door for a general inspection, the killer who has buried the old man below the floorboards finds himself compelled by a force somehow beyond his control to invite the police officers in for tea, only to be haunted by the growing, throbbing of a beating heart below the floorboards. Or is it the beating heart within his own chest? The drumming of the heart overwhelms the killer, who falls apart, admitting to the crime in front of the police, who quickly discover the gruesome scene below the floorboards. Even though these and other famous stories are used to support the notion that Poe was simply obsessed with crime and murder, the fact remains that the theme is never death or crime, but rather the consequence of ignoring the reality of conscience and the higher justice from which no one can escape indefinitely. Without a genuine awareness of the potential for evil and self-deceit within each of us, or the evil that may infiltrate and corrupt not only institutions, but entire nations, even the greatest intellects could find themselves prey to the most heinous and evil perversions, as we'll soon see. The story of Poe's descent into the maelstrom, published in 1841, showcases this sublime power in an acute manner. Within this tale, three brothers find themselves fishing near an unnamed harbor when all of a sudden the sky darkens, a violent storm emerges, and the tranquil sea transforms into a vicious whirlpool, slowly sucking all into the abyss of its dark vortex. One of the three brothers is immediately lost to the sea, while the two surviving brothers attempt to find anything on the boat to grab onto. Amidst the terror, one brother loses his mind and pushes his sibling off of a metal grip at the center of the boat, leaving the other to fall to the floor. Yet the brother who has been pushed does not lose his mind, and despite the terror and chaos of the slowly spinning towards the center of the maelstrom, he takes the time to recognize that the lighter debris and wood never sinks to the center of the whirlpool, but descends only to a limited depth, while heavier and bulkier objects, such as trees or the boat on which both brothers find themselves, are drawn deeper into the center and destroyed. Attempting to teach his younger brother is futile, as his young, terrorized mind has no place for reason, resulting in the elder brother leaping off the boat, holding only a light wooden barrel, and watching sadly as his younger brother perishes on the doomed boat. The lesson is clear. Amidst a crisis, only he who is capable of holding to reason and who has educated his emotions has a chance to survive. Those who lack the emotional fortitude will always be doomed when crisis hits. On the higher quality of evil, which any lover of freedom must guard against if he wishes to understand the nature of the forces haunting America's own corridors of power, Poe brilliantly lays the perverse and tragic oligarchical psyche bare in his stories The Fall of the House of Usher and The Mask of the Red Death. In the former story, a young, depressed European nobleman named Roderick Usher invites a childhood friend to his family's Gothic castle, wherein Usher yearned to find a glimmer of that happiness last experienced during his childhood. Roderick embodies the stagnant and fixed psychological impulses of European nobility as he finds himself stuck between two worlds: the new world of technological progress, optimism, and creative growth in which his friend lives, and which characterized in so many ways 19th century America, and the archaic fantasies of the past grandeur of Roderick's high bloodline, embodied in the image of the derelict and crumbling castle. Ultimately, Roderick is unable to break from his hereditary roots, and the story ends with the disintegration of the castle with the sad, barren twins inside. Roderick and his creepy sister symbolize the end of oligarchical systems. In The Mask of the Red Death, Poe performs a similar exposure of the self-destructive nature of oligarchs who may try to avoid the plagues which their rapacious systems of exploitation inevitably bring on. Even hermetically sealed as they were within their castles, living in orgiastic decadence, they ultimately couldn't escape the destruction which they believed was only reserved for their slaves. Time after time, and following the guiding light of all great tragedians, Poe demonstrates how the inability to experience a quality of creative change within one's heart and mind is almost always the cause of the dismal outcomes depicted in his morbid stories. Rather than tales of death or murder, they are a testament to the sublime human faculty which none of us can deny, and none of us can ignore when faced with imminent tragedy. And this leads us to one of Poe's most celebrated series, his detective stories, a genre which he created. In The Purloined Letter, the third of Poe's three famous Tales of Ratiocination, the character Inspector C. Auguste Dupin embodies the highest caliber of creative healthy mind, which is contrasted with the French prefect and an armada of police officers who are locked in the invisible cage of sterile deductive inductive logic, forever unable to make a discovery and solve a mysterious criminal case. An exasperated French prefect seeks the assistance of Dupin after weeks of painstakingly searching the home of a figure who is the prime suspect in the theft of a letter which holds vast political ramifications and vast rewards if it is recovered. The inspector describes in agonizing detail how his officers have spent weeks taking apart every segment of the suspect's home in search of the letter, but to no avail. The prefect describes how his men have investigated every square inch of the residence.
We took our time. First, we examined the furniture in every room. We opened all the drawers. We looked under the rugs. We searched behind all the paintings on the walls. We opened every book. We removed the boards of the floor. We even took the tops off the tables to see if he had hidden the letter in the table legs. But we cannot find it. What do you advise me to do?
Every technique of inquiry known to them has been exhausted, and their failure has caused them to seek Dupin's help. After several days, Dupin uncovers the letter and gives it to the prefect, who giddily pays Dupin the generous reward, leaving the inspector's home, letter in hand. Dupin's friend and the story's narrator sits awestruck as to how this feat occurred. Dupin then explains how he was able to accomplish the seemingly impossible task by first sharing his insight into the failures of the thinking of the prefect and officers.
The prefect and his cohort fail so frequently, first by default of this identification, and secondly by ill admeasurement of the intellect with which they are engaged. They consider only their own ideas of ingenuity, and, in searching for anything hidden, advert only to the modes in which they would have hidden it. They are right in this much, that their own ingenuity is a faithful representative of that of the mass. But when the cunning of the individual felon is diverse in character from their own, the felon foils them, of course. This always happens when it is above their own, and very usually when it is below. They have no variation of principle in their investigations. At best, when urged by some unusual emergency, by some extraordinary reward, they extend or exaggerate their old modes of practice without touching their principles.
Dupin reveals that the stolen letter was hidden in plain sight, ripped and wrinkled on a card box sitting in open view near a desk, visible to all eyes, but invisible to old defective minds obsessed with deductive analysis. Dupin elaborates upon the superiority of the culprit's creative mind, saying,
I know him well. He is both. As poet and mathematician, he would reason well. As mere mathematician, he could not have reasoned at all, and thus would have been at the mercy of the prefect.
It was Dupin's insight into the failure of linear mathematical logic and the healthy maturation of scientific and aesthetic capacities that the true creative leaps into discovery concepts may occur. Although expressed most transparently in the Purloined Letter, this theme is replicated beautifully in Poe's short stories The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, Meisel's Chess Player, The Murders on the Rue Morgue, and The Gold Bug, to name but a few. But despite the success of his many riveting stories, Poe still had an even greater creative aspiration, which he was about to realize just before his life was mysteriously cut short. When Edgar Poe died, he was en route from Virginia to New York, where he had planned to set up a new type of magazine over which he would have full control, known as the Stylus. Having tirelessly collected $1,500 in subscriptions from supporters in Virginia, Poe was finally about to embark upon a new phase of his life's mission, which he had described as
the one great purpose of my literary life.
Adding,
undoubtedly, unless I die, I will accomplish it.
Poe's creation of his own magazine would liberate him from the shackles of editorial constraints for the first time in his life. Following the guiding model of Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac and his beloved Friedrich Schiller's journal, Thalia, Poe's new magazine was to provide a cultural mass education of the population using drama, poetry, science, and the arts, as well as acting as a platform for great Republican artists and thinkers to rally around during a time of profound crisis in America's history, teetering as it was upon the precipice of dissolution, which would explode within a matter of 12 years in the form of the Civil War. Describing his new journal, Poe stated in his prospectus,
"The stylus will include about 100 royal octavo pages in single column per month, forming 2 thick volumes per year. In its mechanical appearance, it will far surpass all American journals of its kind. It will discuss not only the belles lettres, but very thoroughly the fine arts, with the drama, and more in brief, will give each month a retrospect of our political history. It will enlist the loftiest talent, but employ it not always in the loftiest, at least not always in the most pompous or puritanical way. It will aim at affording a fair and not dishonorable field for the true intellect of the land, without reference to the mere prestige of celebrated names. It will support the general interests of the Republic of Letters and insist upon reading the world at large as the sole proper audience for the author. It will resist the dictation of foreign reviews. It will eschew the stilted dullness of our own quarterlies, and while it may, if necessary, be no less learned, will deem it wiser to be less anonymous and difficult to be more dishonest than they."
Poe's intention to break the practice of anonymous authorship was especially important in the 1840s, as magazines like the Southern Literary Messenger and Graham's Magazine rarely published their authors' names, and this anonymity made it extremely easy to slander and lie without remorse, to the detriment of the minds and morals of the population, and thereby the nation's moral fitness to survive. Poe was about to go into the next phase of a culture war with a powerful printing press based in New York City, influential patriotic allies, and a mission to inspire and create the kind of American culture that would make mob rule and social manipulation an impossible task for America's enemies. Of course, America's foes knew they would have to do everything possible to ensure no such culture would ever be permitted to fully take root in the young republic. In an 1842 editorial, Poe called out this British subversion of America's moral culture, writing,
"We know that the British bear us little but ill will. We know that in no case do they utter unbiased opinions of American books. We know that in the few instances in which our writers have been treated with common decency in England, these writers have either paid homage to English institutions or have had lurking at the bottom of their hearts a secret principle at war with democracy. We do indeed demand the nationality of self-respect. In letters as in government, we require a declaration of independence. A better thing still would be a declaration of war."
What were these British imperial operations which Poe identified and against which he called for a declaration of war? Were they being run by British Republican-minded circles associated with, say, a Keats or Shelley? Was it the earlier literary projects of a Milton or Shakespeare, a Thomas More or Thomas Paine? Since Poe wrote extensively of his love of these writers, we can safely say that another, darker literary current in England was in Poe's sights, in which he saw as a grave threat to the American Republic. So who was running these operations? To answer this question, we must come to review a new organization that was penetrating into the USA at this period, the Young America movement. In the USA, there were two Young Americas seated to carry out this self-cannibalizing mission, the Young America North and Young America South. Where one branch was centered in New England and catered to the abolitionist mindset, the Southern branch was centered in Virginia and catered to those who preferred to defend the institution of human chattel slavery. While the Southern branch of Young America soon took the form of the Confederate leadership, led by such figures as Colonel George Saunders, America's ambassador to England during the presidency of Franklin Pierce, and General Albert Pike, a Grand Master of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, who later co-founded the Ku Klux Klan. The Northern branch of Young America would be led by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The Young America movement emerged out of the Democratic Party during a period when the young USA was still trying to establish its own sovereign culture in the face of the still dominant intellectual, cultural, and economic influence of the British Empire. Emerson published a manifesto called Young America in 1844. There he showcased his disdain for the Constitution of the USA and even called for its dissolution, an objective shared by Albert Pike and the leadership of emerging Confederate states. Emerson wrote,
"At this moment, the terror of old people and of vicious people is that the union of these states be destroyed, as if the union had any real basis than the good pleasure of a majority of its citizens to be united. But the wise and just man will always feel that he stands on his own feet, that he imparts strength to the state, not receives security from it, and if all went down, he and such as he would quite easily combine in a new and better constitution.
But who was Ralph Waldo Emerson, really? Emerson was not only the leader of Young America, but upon his return from England in 1833, he was also the founder of a new movement dubbed Transcendentalism, which had formed a vastly influential cult in the USA around the Gnostic British intellectual Thomas Carlyle, then editor-in-chief of the Edinburgh Review. During his time in England, Emerson was trained intensely by Sir Thomas Carlyle, whom he regarded as his mentor and spiritual guide. Along with the Blackwoods magazine, the Edinburgh Review would serve as the standard-bearer of literary taste, and both outlets promoted Transcendentalism as a new form of mysticism, which, as we'll soon discover, was nothing but a thinly disguised version of very ancient Gnostic paganism. Poe fought against this movement throughout his life, for reasons that will become clear. Poe was highly critical of Carlyle in particular. He considered him a plagiarist filled with monstrous, unblushing egotism, someone who Poe said prioritized mysticism for mysticism's sake. Poe identified Carlyle as one of the greater propagators of Transcendentalism, which contributed to what he described as the sophistry and pretension he found among the American Transcendentalists. In one critique, Poe apparently wrote,
"His remedy is herohood. What is this but inane twaddle monstrous unblushing egotism is one of Carlyle's striking characteristics. Great and learned men, astronomers, philosophers, and others are poor scientific babblers. He alone, it would seem, discerns the reality of things, and has the key to the mysteries of nature. Insight has been granted to no other."
Although known for his use of flowery language promoting personal freedom and equality, like his mentor Thomas Carlyle, Emerson's elitist secret doctrine was maintained throughout his long career and outlined explicitly in his college diaries, where he wrote,
I believe that nobody now regards the maxim that all men are born equal as anything more than a convenient hypothesis or an extravagant declamation. For the reverse is true, that all men are born unequal in personal powers and in those essential circumstances of time, parentage, country, fortune. The least knowledge of natural history of man adds another important particular to these, namely what class of men he belongs to, European, Moor, Tartar, Africa, because nature has plainly assigned different degrees of intellect to these different races, and the barriers between are insurmountable.
In this regard, Emerson's concepts of the USA were no different from the racist vision held by his Southern young American counterparts. Like all occult societies, the Transcendentalists were devoted to a public and secret doctrine, with a public face promoting spiritualism, while the inner elect advanced the revival of the ancient mystery cults, Gnosticism, and the Eleusinian mysteries. Emerson would himself write homages to the Eleusinian mysteries and advanced a philosophy of post-morality writing in his 1841 essay, Self-Reliance.
If I am the devil's child, I will live then from the devil.
In his 1841 short story, Never Bet the Devil Your Head, Poe's character, Mr. Toby Dammit, is described as a mystic transcendentalist with a proclivity to over-exaggerate and foolishly bets his head to the devil. Before the devil arrives on a bridge in the appearance of an old man walking under an arch wearing a mason's apron to oversee the decapitation of the unfortunate Mr. Dammit, Poe's narrator aims several attacks at Kant and Carlyle by name and says, "Is it not impossible that he was affected with the Transcendentals?" Poe's inclusion of the Masonic apron and the arch motifs associated with the figure of the devil on the bridge are direct references to Masonic symbolism, with emphasis on the royal arch ritual that was a principal characteristic of the English Freemasonic lodge structure. This system had begun deeply penetrating the young USA through the York Rite and Scottish Rites, both of which supported Emerson throughout his career. When Emerson returned from his 1833 trip to Europe as the official literary agent for Thomas Carlyle, he first established himself in the Concord, Massachusetts, and became a member of a group known as the Social Circle. This group was run by Concord Democratic Party controller Senator Francis Gorgas, who became close to Emerson. Gorgas's uncle just so happened to be a man named John James Joseph Gorgas, then head of the northern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which, along with the British-run York Rite, was overseeing a takeover of U.S. Masonic lodges at the time. The Scottish Rite inserted itself into the young USA officially in 1801 through the secret police headquarters in Charlestown, South Carolina. This new Masonic order had been established by an aristocratic Genevan soldier employed by the British Empire during the Revolutionary War named Augustin Prévost. His Freemasonic secret order was not dismantled after the war as it should have been, and instead became the basis of a new Rosicrucian Templar Rite. It found protection under Aaron Burr, the vice president under Thomas Jefferson. Burr would attempt several dissolutions of the Union in 1800, 1804, and 1807. With the help of this influential apparatus, Burr became the leader of a significant political machine in New York, which spread to other states dubbed Tammany Hall. Some tales which Poe wrote featuring direct, albeit subtle, references to occult masonry and its evils include the short tale of Ligeia, featuring an initiated fanatic of hidden mysteries who slowly murders his own wife with arsenic-laced wine, and the 1846 short story, The Cask of Amontillado. In The Cask of Amontillado, Poe features a dim-witted Freemason by the name of Fortunato, falling for a trap set by an evil protagonist named Montrésor, who dupes the fool into descending into a crypt deep underground in pursuit of a taste of a rare Amontillado wine. Once sufficiently drunk, and having descended a spiral staircase into a crypt 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, and 7 feet high between two large columns, Montrésor chains his victim and proceeds to build a wall 13 layers of brick high to the piercing screams of Fortunato. As Freemasonic scholar Darren A. Linares has pointed out in Edgar Allan Poe's perverse Masonic degree, The Cask of Amontillado, the elements of Poe's tale leading to the gruesome murder are a direct parallel to the reenactment of the second section of the Fellowcraft degree in Freemasonry when performed in reverse order. Poe's stories indicate that he was well aware of the Masonic influences infiltrating America's institutions and the kind of sordid deeds they were capable of. In How to Write a Blackwood Article and A Predicament, Poe mocked the figure of Margaret Fuller, another disciple of Carlyle and Emerson, who became one of the most famous transcendentalists in the 1840s. In both short stories, Poe hilariously parodies Fuller, using his character Suki Snobbs, aka Psyche Zenobia, an arrogant Blackwoods magazine writer who takes herself far too seriously.
I presume everybody has heard of me. My name is Signora Psyche Zenobia. This I know to be a fact. Nobody but my enemies ever calls me Suki Snobbs. I have been assured that Suki is but a vulgar corruption of psyche, which is good Greek and means the soul. That's me. I'm all soul. And sometimes a butterfly.
While laying out the guidelines for writing a spiritual article for Blackwood, Snobbs writes,
If you know any big words, this is your chance for them. Talk of the Ionic and Eleatic schools, of Archytas, Georgius, and Alcmaeon. Say something about objectivity and subjectivity. Be sure and abuse a man named Locke. Turn up your nose at things in general, and when you let slip anything a little too absurd, you need not be at the trouble of scratching it out, but just add a footnote. This would look erudite and frank.
In a predicament, Snobbs' devotion to radical sensualism results in her trying to describe each sensation of her head getting cut off by the arms of a massive clock, and then philosophizing about whether her spirit exists in her severed head or body. The decapitated character says,
I will candidly confess that my feelings were now of the most singular, nay, of the most mysterious, the most perplexing and incomprehensible character. My senses were here and there at one and the same moment. With my head, I imagined at one time that I, the head, was the real Signora Psyche Zenobia. At another, I felt convinced that myself, the body, was the proper identity. To clear my ideas on this topic, I felt in my pocket for my snuff box, but upon getting it and endeavoring to apply a pinch of its grateful contents in the ordinary manner, I became immediately aware of my peculiar deficiency, and threw the box at once down to my head.
In her 1841 Transcendentalist Manifesto, Margaret Fuller lived up to Poe's satire by repeatedly speaking self-referentially of her own enlightenment and re-emphasized Carlyle's thesis that intellect was incompatible with divine understanding, saying,
The intellect has no answer to this question, yet as we through faith and purity of deed enter into the nature of the divine, it is answered from our own experience. We understand, though we cannot explain the mystery of something gained where all already is.
By imposing this dichotomy between the understanding and intellect, Fuller was not only situating herself as a disciple of Carlyle and Kant, but also the cult of Gnosticism that pervaded early Christianity prior to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Margaret Fuller, who called her mentor Emerson "my druid," described her own syncretic ideal for a New World spirituality, writing in her Transcendentalist credo,
I have no trouble so far from the sacrifice required of Abraham. It as prefiguring a thought, to be fully expressed by the death of Christ. Yet forget not that they who passed their children through the fire to Moloch were pious also, and not more superstitious than an exclusive devotion to Christ has made many of his followers. Do you not place Christ, then, in a higher place than Socrates, for instance, or Michelangelo? Yes, because if his life was not truer, it was deeper, and he is a representative of ages. But then, I consider the Greek Apollo as one also.
Fuller strangely praises the story of Abraham's willingness to commit child sacrifice and God's sacrifice of Jesus, making a point to equate these instances of sacrifice with the faith of those who committed mass child sacrifices to the ancient deity Moloch, which poured innocent blood across pagan altars of Phoenicia for centuries. Is it any wonder, then, that Fuller considered the Pythian solar deity Apollo at the heart of the ancient system of oracles as co-equivalent to the figure of Jesus? Before Henry David Thoreau wrote his environmentalist Bible, Walden, he wrote of his ideal pagan revival in his 1849 A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers.
In my pantheon, Pan still reigns in his pristine glory, with his ruddy face, his flowing beard and his shaggy body, his pipe and his crook, his nymph Echo and his chosen daughter Iambe. For the great god Pan is not dead, as was rumored. No god ever dies. Perhaps, of all the gods of New England and of ancient Greece, I am most constant at his shrine.
It must be recalled that Pan, adored by Thoreau and Fuller, embodied more than a mythical creature. He was a universal archetype of hedonism that shaped the ancient pagan mysteries. Old Pan, the shepherd's god, had a half-human, half-animal shape, bearded, horned, and hairy, lively, agile, swift, and crafty. He expressed animal cunning. He preyed sexually upon nymphs and boys indifferently, and after the 5th century, his image became the incarnation of the horned Satan adored by medieval witch covens, and even the androgynous image of Baphomet worshipped by Templar initiates. Pan became associated not only with a rampant hedonism, but also child molestation and even sacrifice across the ages. The fusing of the sacred and profane embodied by Pan was also featured in those Apollo, sun god Dionysus lunar deity rituals, which formed the backbone of the rites of Eleusis. Thoreau's mentor Ralph Waldo Emerson himself embraced both nature worship and pagan ideals devoid of a sense of duty to or love of humankind. Instead, Emerson's transcendental gospel was centered around the individual's desires before everything, stating that each human aims to be somebody set up for himself to truck and higgle for a private good, and in particulars to ride that he may ride, to dress that he may be dressed, to eat that he may eat, and to govern that he may be seen. In Emerson's thesis of the Oversoul, any moral, reasonable, directing influence to the universe was replaced by a vague energy flow of each element within creation, exerting its desire to be, devoid of any elements of justice, which resulted in an all being co-equal to all, and the oversoul, aka all, being co-equal with each thing in reality. It wasn't hard for Emerson to make the Kabbalistic leap to conclude that the initiated elite of Emerson's Masonic societies are, in all seriousness, God. Not a divine being made in the image of God, but rather God itself. And that brings us to one of Poe's most famous fictional tales. In Poe's short story, The Murder of Marie Roget, published in 1842, Inspector C. Auguste Dupin is challenged to solve the mysterious murder of a beautiful young woman in Paris. Poe's fictional narrative was actually based on events surrounding the very real 1841 murder of a New York woman named Marie Cecilia Rogers, who had worked as a cigar girl in a popular New York lounge run by John Anderson. Anderson was a leading figure within the Freemasonic Tammany Hall political machine that installed President Andrew Jackson into the White House in 1832. Anderson's cigar emporium happened to be an intelligence hub frequented by leading members of the intelligentsia. On July 25, 1841, Marie Rogers told her fiancé Daniel Payne, who also lived with Mary in a boarding house managed by Mary and her mother, that she was about to visit her aunt and would return that evening. 3 days later, the heavily decayed body of Marie Cecilia Rogers was discovered floating in the Hudson River next to a strange location dubbed Sibyl's Cave, located on the estate owned by an illustrious New Jersey family. Beyond the obvious decay, her body was tied with rope and beaten beyond recognition with signs of extreme sexual violation. It didn't take long for every press outlet of New York to run sensationalist stories about her murder, turning her death into a national obsession. It was the first case of a national media hysteria surrounding a violent murder mystery in U.S. history. However, when we scratch beyond the surface of this murder case, and Poe's short story specifically, a much darker picture emerges, showcasing evidence of the occult takeover of the USA that was already underway during Poe's lifetime. Edgar Allan Poe didn't want anyone to be confused about the real-life story behind his fictional tale, writing in the story's introduction.
The extraordinary details which I am now called upon to make public will be found to form, as regards sequence of time, the primary branch of a series of scarcely intelligible coincidences, whose secondary or concluding branch will be recognized by all readers in the late murder of Mary Cecilia Rogers at New York.
Many Americans reading the popular press, especially Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, were quick to blame Mary's fiancé Daniel Payne as the guilty party in the heinous crime. Despite having an alibi, Payne was demonized across the press, and on October 8, 1841, the same date of Poe's death exactly 8 years later, his dead body was also found lying on a bench next to Sibyl's Cave in New Jersey. Next to his body was a broken vial of laudanum, a fast-working poison, with a note in his pocket reading,
"To the world, here I am on the spot. God forgive me for my misfortune in my misspent time."
Was Payne's death a suicide as popularly believed. Was he party to the murder of his fiancée and killed himself out of guilt? However, like the narrative of Marie Roget, even here the popular explanation for his death doesn't add up, as the coroner conducting Payne's autopsy discovered no sign of laudanum in his body and could not account for the actual cause of death. For months, other press agencies blamed street gangs as the culprit, while other newspapers even promoted the narrative that Marie Roget was still alive, since the body was supposedly too far decomposed to be properly identified. More than 1 year later, in October 1842, a woman named Frederica Loss, who was an owner of a tavern near the site of Mary's murder, was accidentally shot by one of her sons. Loss had been in the public eye since Mary's body was first discovered, as Loss had apparently witnessed the young girl in her tavern with a mysterious man the night of her death, and it was one of the Loss's sons who discovered Mary's clothes in some bushes weeks after the killing. Among Loss's final words before dying, she indicated that Marie Roget had died during a failed abortion that took place at her tavern a year earlier. Loss's deathbed testimony became the final word on Mary's death, and since that time, all experts have come to the consensus that Marie Roget had died during an abortion. Case closed. However, if this were so, then why was her face beaten beyond recognition? Why were there strangulation wounds around her neck? Why the extreme mutilation of her abdomen and womb? Why the strange death of her fiancé just 2 months later at the same location? Clearly, things weren't adding up. Edgar Poe had every reason to believe another darker picture was afoot, and while he admitted that there was more to the story than the facts which he revealed in The Murder of Marie Roget, the larger pattern of events surrounding Mary's murder led the mind to grapple with a much darker and disturbing picture surrounding the murder of the beautiful cigar girl. But why Mary? Why was this young lady chosen for a heinous crime? Was there any particular reason to select Mary for a possible ritual murder? Well, what if we said Mary wasn't your typical beautiful cigar girl? To address this darker picture, we'll have to reevaluate the environment in which Mary worked in New York and the location in which she died. Doug McGowan noted the strategic location of Mary's cigar lounge, writing,
"Literary notables such as James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, and Edgar Allan Poe frequented the cigar shop where Mary worked. More importantly, reporters and editors of New York City's newspapers were also patrons of the store. After the discovery of her body, those same reporters put the cigar girl's death on the front pages."
As an established Poe researcher, Alan Salisbury in 1981, Cooper, Irving, and Poe were in fact closely aligned agents of the Society of Cincinnati and were all operating simultaneously in Europe in 1830 alongside fellow Cincinnati member Marquis Lafayette during the latter's failed effort to establish a republican revolution across Europe. The Society of Cincinnati was formed by leading founding fathers of the Revolutionary War and included among its roster David Poe, the grandfather of Edgar, and Quartermaster General of Washington's armies. The idea was simple, although the execution was admittedly flawed and susceptible to corruption and infiltration during the decades following the War of Independence. in order to form a multi-generational cadre of leaders capable of being trained in the arts of philosophy and cultural warfare, and thus preserve the vision of 1776 to form a more perfect union. The Society of the Cincinnati was formed as a counterintelligence service open to all children and grandchildren of the leaders of the Revolution. The name Cincinnatus was inspired by the noble Roman soldier who during a time of crisis had been called upon to leave his farm and come out of retirement to save the Roman Republic when no other qualified leadership existed. Cincinnatus was given absolute dictatorial powers, but he never abused them. After carrying out his duty, the nation was saved and he gave his power back to the Senate and people, returning once more to his farm. This example inspired the best of Republican virtue, and hence the name was born. Poe was not only a member of this organization, whose European president was none other than Marquis de Lafayette, but as evidence demonstrates, Poe even found himself in France in 1831 after leaving West Point, where he took part in the last serious effort to install the Marquis Lafayette as President of France. In 1831, Poe asked fellow Society of Cincinnati member General Sylvanus Thayer, then head of West Point, for assistance in his planned journey to contribute to revolutionary plans in France and Poland, writing,
Dear Sir, having no longer any ties which can bind me to my native country, I intend by the first opportunity to proceed to Paris with the view of obtaining, through the interest of the Marquis de Lafayette, an appointment, if possible, in the Polish army. In the event of the interference of France on behalf of Poland, this may easily be effected. At all events, it will be my only feasible plan of procedure. The object of this letter is respectfully to request that you will give me such assistance as may lie in your power in the furtherance of my views. A certificate of standing in my class is all that I have any right to expect. Anything further, a letter to a friend in Paris or to the Marquis, would be a kindness which I should never forget.
Although the image of Poe as a deviant sociopath who never left America throughout his lifetime has persisted, another piece of evidence can be added to the court. In 1929, a rare book dealer named David Wells discovered a letter from the hand of French author Alexandre Dumas, himself a leading organizer of Republican movements in Europe, as well as a great poet and author. The letter referred to a meeting Dumas had in 1832 with one Edgar Poe.
It was about the year 1832. One day, an American presented himself at my house with an introduction from James Fenimore Cooper. Needless to say, I welcomed him with open arms. His name was Edgar Poe. From the outset, I realized that I had to deal with a remarkable man.
Cooper, Poe, and Irving were also exposing oligarchical operations against America's people and Republican institutions throughout their many fictional writings. Within his 1830 work, The Bravo, set in Venice, Cooper introduces the reader to the dark and perverse system of the Venetian Republic and its structures of power contrasted with the healthier American example of a republic founded on the belief that all men were created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. In his 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Washington Irving, U.S. ambassador to Spain during Lafayette's 1830 efforts to establish republics in Europe, subtly exposes the Eastern Establishment Power Center in upper state New York in the town of Sleepy Hollow, which was then infusing occult Freemasonic power structures in the USA on behalf of European oligarchical interests. Going back to our young cigar girl, Marie Cecilia Rogers maintained a second job working in a boarding house with her widowed mother Phoebe in the heart of the Publishers' Row, then the central point of the new mass media industry in America. Historian Amy Gilman Spregnick wrote of the strategic location of the Rogers boarding house.
The Rogers boarding house was located on Publishers' Row, just 1 block south of Printing House Square, at the epicenter of the city's thriving publishing industry. Nassau Street and its environs was the city's brain, ever pulsating with the beating of a printing engine. Within a few steps of the Rogers residence were the offices of most of the city's major newspapers and publishing houses, as well as the headquarters of reform and evangelical publications.
Upon arriving in New York from their ancestral home in Connecticut in 1837, Phoebe and her young daughter first lived at the house of John Anderson. Anderson was an extremely powerful player within a vast political machine called Tammany Hall, which was created by arch traitor Aaron Burr, and which had only recently succeeded in installing a Scottish Rite president into power in the form of Andrew Jackson. Amy Spregnick writes,
Anderson had commercial and political ties that placed him within a distinctly new and powerful subculture of the city, taking form around Tammany Hall.
She goes on to state,
Anderson moved in the New York circle of late Jacksonian Democrats committed to free trade, low tariffs, and states' rights, as well as firm opposition to the Whig tradition.
John Anderson was also the owner of the same tobacco emporium near City Hall where Mary began working in 1838. How did Mary and Phoebe come to know John Anderson before moving to New York, such that they were brought into his home and provided assistance to start a boarding house and receive employment for Mary? Were they involved in the sort of espionage that pervaded New York during this period? Why did Anderson suffer a life of haunting visions of Mary from the day she died until his own last days in Paris in the 1880s? His friend and former associate, Senator Abner Mattoon, noted that he said she appeared to him in the spirit from time to time, and that he had many, very many, unhappy days and nights in regard to her. Passing Mary's boarding house, Anderson's friend Felix McCloskey testified that he would dramatically denounce it as the damned house, which was the cause driving him out of politics and belittling him in New York, and which had kept him from advancing. Anderson was also quoted by McCloskey as saying, "I want people to believe that I had no hand in her taking off." Why was Anderson so paranoid and driven to near insanity over the murder of Mary? What was weighing on his conscience? It is worth taking note of another anomaly before proceeding towards the deeper implications of Sibyl's Cave, that is, the incredible family connections of Mary Rogers. Spregnick writes of Mary's prestigious American lineage.
Mary Rogers was the descendant of two of New England's ministerial elite and descendants of Richard Mather, one of Connecticut's first settlers, and the Rogers, descendants of James Rogers, also an early Connecticut settler, an associate of Winthrop's son and Connecticut founder, John Winthrop, Jr.
Mary Rogers was the descendant of two of New England's ministerial elite and descendants of Richard Mather, one of Connecticut's first settlers, and the Rogerses, descendants of James Rogers, also an early Connecticut settler and associate of Winthrop's son and Connecticut founder, John Winthrop, Jr. Mary's connections to the Mather family derived from her mother, Phoebe's first husband, Connecticut industrialist Ezra Mather. Ezra was the great-grandson of Cotton Mather, the father of the New England Republican cause, enemy of the Hellfire Club penetration of New England, and patron of a young Benjamin Franklin. As the historian Graham Lowry demonstrated in his pioneering book, How the Nation Was Won, in 1720, an elderly John Winthrop Jr. and Cotton Mather stood in opposition to the spread of the Hellfire Clubs across the English colonies, one branch being led by Benjamin Franklin's own older brother, James Franklin. Graham Lowry also documents Cotton Mather's deployment of a young Benjamin Franklin into London's Hellfire Club during the 1720s, whose work provided invaluable intelligence used by America's Republican intelligentsia in the decades prior to the American Revolution. As Lowry demonstrates, because James was the elder brother of Ben Franklin, the young disciple of Cotton Mather's, was well placed to infiltrate his older brother's Hellfire operations. Neither Cotton Mather nor his father, Increase Mather, president of Harvard from 1681 to 1701, were friendly to occultists, alchemists, and necromancers penetrating Connecticut and Massachusetts. They were working with the Winthrops, overseeing the purge of witch covens and satanic cults active within the early New England colonies. These facts will play a very important role in the story of Marie Cecilia Rogers. From their marriage in 1796 until Ezra's untimely death in 1808 at the young age of 38, Phoebe and Ezra Mathers lived in a luxurious estate in Lyme, Connecticut, and ranked among the most elite families of New England. The couple had 4 children, although only one, Frederick, born in 1808, lived long enough to marry and have children. In 1814, 6 years after Ezra had died a mysterious death, Phoebe remarried one Daniel Rogers, who was reputed to be the father of Marie Cecilia Rogers, although the story may also have a touch of myth. Phoebe's daughter from her first marriage to Ezra Mathers would have been 21 years old when Mary was born, and Poe researcher Emmy Spregnick has speculated that Mary Rogers may have been adopted by her grandmother after her mother's early death. Were that hypothesis true, then Mary would have been a direct descendant of the Mathers bloodline. But the question remains, why did Phoebe go through all of this effort? Why would a surviving member of a family which was quickly going extinct wish to keep a secret line of Ezra Mathers' offspring? 3 of Phoebe's 4 children and her second husband Daniel Rogers all died between 1829 and 1834. Something caused Phoebe to decide that Connecticut was no longer a safe place to live, and soon moved to New York with Mary. Mary's father, or adopted father, Daniel, also had a peculiar genealogy. Daniel's great-grandfather, John Rogers, was the founder of a religious sect known as the Rogerines, which was a spin-off of the Quakers and the Seventh-day Baptists, and maintained its existence until the 20th century. Daniel Rogers' older brother, Moses Rogers, was an expert in steam navigation and world explorer who worked closely with American inventor and painter Robert Fulton. Fulton was the inventor of the first commercial steamboats, who brought this old family its final fame and recognition while simultaneously pushing into modern times. The inventor Robert Fulton was himself deeply enmeshed in counterintelligence and operated in England for several years, working closely with Benjamin Franklin's friend Benjamin West, an American-born painter who became the president of England's Royal Academy of Fine Arts from 1780 until 1810. Fulton was known as the prophet of railways and led the fight to bring railroads to America, along with vast canal systems, sitting as a member of the Erie Canal Commission from 1811 to 1815. Robert Fulton's primary nemesis in America was one Colonel John Stevens III, whom some have speculated stole many of the designs for steamships and canal building technologies developed by Fulton, transforming it into a vast fortune and gaining control of all steam shipping transiting between New York and New Jersey by 1820. It was during a legal battle over the control of ferry boats from New Jersey to New York in 1815 in Congress that Fulton died after testifying against Stevens on February 24, 1815. This vast fortune allowed Stevens to purchase nearly all of Hoboken, New Jersey, and it was upon his vast estate and directly under a Gothic castle dubbed Stevens Castle that John Stevens's heirs constructed a strange tourist attraction dubbed Sibyl's Cave, covered by a Gothic gateway. Surrounding Sibyl's Cave, the Stevens family constructed a 12-hectare public garden dubbed the Elysian Fields. Why did they do this? What relevance does Sibyl's Cave and the Elysian Fields have in world history? What exactly did the Stevens clan have in mind when constructing and naming these strange locations where Mary Rogers was to be found murdered?
Listen, listen, Mary mine, to the wisp of the Apennine. It bursts on the roof like the thunder's roar, or like the sea on a northern shore, heard in its raging ebb and flow by the captives pent in the cave below.
While many people fixate on the multitude of elaborate details in this murder mystery, the most interesting and often overlooked anomaly is the very site where Mary's body was discovered. For it was on July 28, 1841, that two men saw the body floating just a few feet away from the mouth of a peculiar place called Sibyl's Cave in Hoboken, New Jersey. Hoboken's Sibyl's Cave sits at the foot of Stevens Castle, built in 1792 and overlooking the Hudson River, also called Castle Point. Sibyl's Cave itself is 10 feet above sea level, 30 feet in length, and 100 feet west of the Hudson River, and features a natural subterranean river within it where mineral water was sold to tourists during the 19th century. The cave entrance is fitted with Gothic gates and is adjacent to a vast, privately owned park dubbed the Elysian Fields. The strange decision by several members of the clan, including Colonel John Stevens III, to construct Sibyl's Cave in 1832, built during an occult purge of U.S. Masonic lodges and occult takeover of the USA launched in 1826, raises many questions as to the true motive of the Stevens clan. So what was Sibyl's Cave, anyways? In ancient times, pagan oracles represented the bridges between the spirit realm, where demons, gods, spirits, and the dead lived, and the material realm of mortals. These oracles took the name Sibyls. According to Greek legend, there were 10 such dominant Sibyls spread across the Roman Empire. It was the Cumaean Sibyl, aka the 7th Sibyl, who was reputed to have sold the famed Sibylline books, featuring symbolism-laced transcripts of the drugged-up musings of the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, to Rome's last king, Tarquin, in 500 BC. These Sibylline books, 3 in number, interpreted only by a high priest caste, were consulted for the Roman Senate's every major policy decision for the ensuing centuries, at least until 86 BC, when they were burned and replaced with new oracular prophecies, also dubbed the Sibylline books. The Cumaean Sibyl was housed in a cave in Naples above dozens of subterranean tunnels built during the Roman Empire. They were also used for initiation rituals that haven't been fully disclosed to this day. In the Aeneid, it was the Cumaean Sibyl that directed the hero, Aeneas, to the underworld to seek counsel with his dead father. Although the Cumaean Sibyl is the most well-known of the ancient oracles, Sibyl's cave in Hoboken, New Jersey was not built in homage to her, but rather to a stranger oracle dubbed the Apennine Sibyl, also known as the 11th Sibyl of the ancient world, located in the mountains of Nursia, Italy, which was the hometown of a Roman patrician turned mystic Christian named Saint Benedict and his twin sister Scholastica in 480. The relevance of Saint Benedict's connection to this location will become clearer later. At the base of the Sibylline Mountains are found the Elysian Fields, named after the section of the underworld reserved for the demigods and heroes.
So I folded me in fears, and Dante searched the triple spheres, molding nature at his will, so shaped, so colored, swift or still, and sculptor-like his large design, etched on Alp and Apennine.
According to the ancient Greek writings of Hesiod and Pindar, the Elysian Fields was a subdomain contained within Hades' underworld. It was described as something of a hedonistic Garden of Eden, which promised its tenants immortal pleasures without any limits. Medieval legends spoke of the Apennine cave entrance near one of the peaks of the Sibylline mountain in Nursia as an access point to the underground kingdom of Queen Sibylla, also known as the Queen of the Fairies. This fabled kingdom was said to be fed by underground water from caverns which promised immortality and voluptuous pleasure forever. Knights would venture far and wide to find this Queen Sibylla, whose countless fairies would take on the appearance of beautiful women in the daylight, yet who would turn into monsters at night. During the day, they would have to keep their legs hidden, or else their goat feet would be visible and frighten young men before they could become addicted to the charm of the subterranean kingdom from which few would ever return. Recall Henry David Thoreau's embrace of Pan, its connection to Satanism, and the hedonistic imagery of this half-human, half-goat deity expressed by occult underground sects across the ages. Since the 1960s, the cave's entrance has been inaccessible due to damage caused by violent earthquakes, making modern exploration of the cave extremely difficult. However, in the year 2000, a team of scientists from the Department of Earth Sciences at Camarino University carried out georadar surveys confirming the existence of a vast underground complex of tunnels and caverns 15 meters below ground level of the Sibylline Mountains, with some cavities over 150 meters in length. Amidst the Elysian Fields is a lake called the Lake of Pilato, named after the burial site of Pontius Pilate, who governed Judea from 26 to 36 and oversaw the execution of Jesus of Nazareth. Dr. M. Talame, the Officer for Sustainable Tourism and Education for the Sibylline National Park, describes the history of the Sibylline Caves of Naples and the Apennine Sibyl in the following manner.
She, the Cumaean Sibyl, lived in a cave near the summit of Mount Sibylla.
And since time immemorial, she shaped the culture and in the imagination of the people of the Monti Sibillini, firstly as a pagan symbol of fertility, venerated within the tradition of earth worshipping, and then later she also became part of Christian iconography, which is evidenced by numerous paintings in some local churches. The Apennine Sibyl is a controversial figure whose fame as a witch and heretic enchantress was actually renowned in many parts of Europe in the 15th century, and the name of these mountains is a tribute to her importance. In front of her cave opens the beautiful valley of the Lago di Pilato, and legend relates that this lake is the tomb or resting place of the Roman consul who condemned Jesus Christ to death. Both Monte Sibylla and Lago di Pilato were frequented for centuries by necromancers, esoterics, and by mysterious people. Throughout history, these two sites repeatedly attracted the attention of the Pope, who sought to physically prevent access to these locations in order to repress what was perceived as dangerous tendencies. There are reports that entire villages in the Sibillini, like that of Monte Monaco, were excommunicated. Pitchforks were placed on the high-altitude mountain routes as a warning to travelers. Certainly, some people came with the intention of consecrating their magic books to the devil, but perhaps others were harmless herbalists who at the time were already fascinated by the biodiversity of these mountains.
Domenico Aringoli and Gilberto Pambianchi of the University of Camerino describe the importance of the caverns within the Apennine Mountains of Nursia for initiation rites and their still existent influence for occult pilgrims today.
The intrinsic mystery of the initiatory cults practiced in caves, and in particular in the high hypogean side of the Sibyl mountain, known in Europe back in the ancient times as the center of the Apennine Oracle, as well as having been transmitted from the Middle Ages onwards through cult narration, continued and still continues to be virtually alive for a large number of the pilgrims that have passed by here in time.
This site is likely second only to the Isle of Capri off the coast of Amalfi, Italy, which was given over to the Benedictine order in the 6th century and which housed both the vast caves of Mithra and temples of Sibyl, where Emperor Tiberius, who appointed Pilate, hosted his orgiastic rituals fusing the sexual frenzy of Dionysus and Bacchus at night, mixed with Apollonian rituals of the solar deity by day. In the Lives of the 12 Caesars, Roman historian Suetonius records how Emperor Vitellius celebrated a sacred vigil on the slopes of the Apennines. Another Roman historian recounted how in 268, Emperor Claudius Gothicus sought a prophecy from the Apennine Sibyl. The poet Fazio degli Uberti published an account of the Apennine Sibyl in his Dittamondo, saying,
The poet Fazio degli Uberti published an account of the Apennine Sibyl in his Dittamondo, saying, I don't want to overlook the renown of the Mount of Pilatus, where a lake is, to which is described in Simon the Sorcerer. People used to ascend to consecrate their spellbooks according to what local people say.
To make this point explicit, Simon the Sorcerer is a reference to Simon the Magician from the Bible, a Samaritan mystic who came to Rome during the reign of Claudius and who attempted to infiltrate the early Christian church. According to the writings of 2nd century church leaders Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyon, and Eusebius, Simon the Sorcerer promoted sacred orgies, cannibalism, and child sacrifice within a Christian framework. Simon also promoted himself off as a god-man who had mastered and superseded the teachings of Jesus Christ. And just as Jesus hid sacred prostitute Mary Magdalene, according to Gnostic doctrine, Simon also had a prostitute priestess named Helen, who was herself an incarnation of the Gnostic archon, Sophia. As long as his followers practiced the dark rites taught by Simon the magician, they were promised physical immortality, forever cheating death, and free to indulge in base hedonism for all eternity. According to Domenico Arungoli and Gilberto Pambianchi of the University of Camerino, many of the Templars, alchemists, spiritualists, Cathars, Paterini, etc., who survived the church's crackdown in the 14th century, had found shelter in the land of the Sibylla. In this light, despite the many centuries between the construction of Sibyl's cave in New Jersey and the occult networks hidden within the mountains of Nursia, a prophet historical triangulation of facts leads us to an unexpected connection between the emergence of a new young republic and the historic forces of occultism and oligarchy plaguing the world to this very day. So is it possible to use Poe's method of ratiocination to make sense of the many points of intersection in the story of America's battle against ancient imperial powers and the many details surrounding the mystery of Poe's own murder, or that of Marie Roget? Of course, the most challenging thing when dealing with such topics as secret societies, secret intelligence operations, and occult rituals is simply that the very depth of secrecy involved means that we will have very little direct empirical evidence to use in our analysis. Thus, any attempt to approach this matter with the method of thinking promoted by transcendentalists or radical empiricists, who believe that reality is only accessible through sense perception, fails miserably, just like Poe's French prefect. However, like his Inspector Dupin, Poe's method of ratiocination will allow us to triangulate into the causal dynamics shaping the murder of these two associated players on the stage of world history. In that sense, while we acknowledge that absolute mathematical certainty will remain elusive, strong hypotheses that get us extremely close to the causality are yet accessible to us. While Poe never provided a full resolution to the mystery of Marie Roget's murder in his fictional stories, her direct connection to a patriotic counter-espionage network in which Poe was directly involved cannot be ignored. Is it possible that her position within the close network of Tammany Hall's John Anderson made her a reliable conduit of sensitive information, useful to Poe and his fellow Society of Cincinnati member James Fenimore Cooper? After all, Fenimore's famous stories like The Spy and The Bravo were also filled with themes of espionage and the twisted nature of oligarchical systems, indicating he too was all too familiar with the machinations of evil. Certainly, Anderson's lifelong guilt complex echoes the sort of psychological breakdown exposed by Poe in stories like The Telltale Heart, The Imp of the Perverse, and The Black Cat. The association with Sibyl's cave and evidence of ritual murder at a location tied to both the Stevens clan and the ancient mystery cult of the Apennine Sibyl cannot be ignored either. It was this sacred site of ancient paganism which formed an oasis for satanic cults and even Templar priests who sought protection during their years of persecution. And it was this same pagan secret order that was to re-emerge in the form of secret cults such as the Bohemian Brethren over the years, which would be accused of child abductions, human sacrifice, and ritual orgies within the forests of Bohemia, Italy, Switzerland, and even the young British and Dutch colonies of the Americas. The practice of witchcraft expanded during these centuries leading up to the American Revolution, The leadership role played by Cotton Mather and his father, Increase Mather, in stopping both the witch covens of the colonies on the one side, as well as the radical excesses of the superstitious zealots among evangelical witch hunters on the other side, cannot be overstated. It was this dual crisis of fanatic inquisitorial witch hunts on the one hand and actual occult witch covens, often masquerading under Christian costumes, which threatened to destroy the dream of a new republic of moral reason that Cotton Mather's protege Benjamin Franklin worked so hard to advance from the 1720s onward. Is it thus possible that Mary's murder and the murder of her father and his children may have at least in part expressed a multi-generational revenge curse? We know also that the inner high priests of such organizations as the Order of Templars, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and others, were united in a common mission to undermine the institutions of Christianity while restoring the pagan mysteries that animated the ancient world. After all, these are the same agencies which oversaw the creation of the Jesuits, the Rosicrucians, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and even the Transcendentalist movement. So is it possible that Poe was in fact killed by this parasite, which the best leaders of the American Revolution, including Poe's own grandfather, had attempted, although failed, to destroy? The evil institutions which Poe exposed, and the dangerous philosophies with which he did battle during his lifetime, were not inclined to tolerate the sort of powerful truth-telling mind and brilliant wit represented by the genius and detective mind of an Edgar Poe. But more important than his exposure of evil, perhaps most important in conceptualizing the power of Poe's mind and purpose, was the legacy of artistic brilliance and insight into the human condition which he left in his wake. For in truth, nothing frightens these occult forces more than having a mirror held up to their own sordid psyches. Perhaps the truth of Poe's murder lies in plain sight. Regardless of whether we'll ever know the full story of Poe's murder or Mary's, what we do know is someone or something was intent on making sure that the real Edgar Allan Poe would never be known. Here, let us renew our commitment to a true republic of letters everywhere, and ensure that the lies against Edgar Allan Poe shall be repeated nevermore.